Good afternoon and welcome to an EAS short course on equipment sanitation best practices presented by EAS Consulting Group's David Bloomquist and Jennifer Kane. We are pleased that you're joining us, and David and Jennifer have prepared an excellent training for you, which will be presented in 3 1.5-hour sessions. EAS Consulting Group is a member of the Certified Family of Companies and is a global leader in regulatory solutions for industries regulated by FDA, USDA, and other federal and state agencies. Our network of over 150 independent advisors and consultants enables EAS to provide comprehensive consulting, training, and auditing services, ensuring proactive regulatory compliance. Independent consultant David Bloomquist spent much of his career as a technical support specialist at the Ecolab Food and Beverage Division. His early career included quality assurance and quality control roles in several food operations, and he also served in the Peace Corps of Morocco and worked as a chemist, testing products in the Moroccan equivalent of the US FDA. Independent consultant Jennifer Kane is a food safety and quality professional with over 36 years of technical and practical experience across multiple food categories. Her expertise includes quality systems development and implementation with a focus on training in food safety, allergen, and HACCP requirements. She is also an FSPCA trainer and FSPCA lead instructor for FSMA. As a reminder, you may ask any questions by typing them into the questions box. And with that, I'll turn the presentation first over to Jennifer.
Thank you, Amy. I want to thank all of you for participating in this webinar today. Dave and I hope that by the end you will leave with information that you can use to strengthen your sanitation and your food safety programs. And Amy, it's not advancing. Okay, got it. So today in this module, I will be covering recall, an overview of recalls, recall and outbreaks, warning letters and the importance of them, and some lessons learned. So what I thought I would start with is just a brief overview of recall classifications. Most of you, I'm sure, are very familiar with these classifications, but I just wanted to highlight them to you. Class 1 is the most severe with reasonable probability of serious adverse health consequences or death. Class 2 may or may not cause temporary or medically reversible adverse health consequences, and Class 3 is not likely to cause adverse health consequences. It's almost always the case where Class 1 recalls you must give public notice. Class 2 recalls you may or may not have to give public notice, and Class 3 recalls are typically market withdrawals. And it's important that you go to the FDA website. You can go to ORA, recall coordinators, and you can actually find your recall coordinator for that area, that region. And you want to make sure that these people, that the person is listed in your recall plan so you can quickly get to that information when you need it, when and if you need it. So as I mentioned, Class 1 recalls typically would lead to that market withdrawal, actually lead to that public notice. Class 1 recalls are typically always Sakota hazards. And Sakota hazards it's an acronym for serious adverse health consequences or death to human or animals. And FDA, as you probably know with the new regulation, they do have authority to mandate recalls, but it's usually common for firms to initiate their own recall before FDA were to mandate it to you. The Reportable Food Registry, RFR, is the electronic portal that industry uses to report when there could be a reasonable probability that a food could cause serious adverse health consequences. And I just wanted to stress to you all, if you don't do it are ready to sign up for the FDA website to get these recall notices. It's very valuable information. It may not affect you and your company, but you can certainly learn from it. And sometimes, as we will mention in this module, a recall that occurs today may affect you tomorrow, especially if the supply chain indicates you could be part of the recall. So one of the big drivers of FSMA regulation was the Peanut Corporation of America, the Salmonella outbreak that occurred in 2008, 2009. And this was really a tipping point for FSMA. There were 9 deaths, 714 illnesses, and well over 3,900 products recalled, and over 350 companies affected. And some of you were probably part of that, as was I when I was with the Kellogg's company. And this recall had a huge effect on our company. It really changed the way we did business as far as we looked at our suppliers, our supply base, our supply chain. And we were making, at one of our facilities, a peanut butter sandwich. And because it was affected, the recall closed down our plant for 6 months. It was around about $100 million impact to the business, to the company. And we had a lot of learnings. One of them was that we did not have a break for sanitation in the peanut butter process, which has been typical in peanut butter processing and also some chocolate processing, that you didn't break the lines, so you didn't have a potential for contamination at that break. But because we had no break, we did have to recall everything back forever because there was no way to determine which lot was affected and which wasn't. So just a few of the findings included from the Peanut Corporation of America outbreak: COA pathogen test results, reporting issues. Not only did they misrepresent the facts, but they falsified the documents. At some point, they would have a positive for salmonella, and they would take another sample before they would send the COA results out. I know our experience was that the COA read 25-gram sample, and that was their test result in the 25-gram sample. And we quickly realized that we needed to have a more representative sample from sensitive ingredients such as peanut butter, in this case, and have a more composite sample, something like an FDA BAM 2 × 375-gram composite sample. So that's an important thing to consider. And then lack of sanitation of the peanut paste production line after positive salmonella results. So this was potential for cross-contamination. There was no roaster validation information, no studies to prove that every time temperature, belt speed, volume, that organism was killed, salmonella organism was killed in the process. There was raw and roasted peanut storage contamination, mold and water contamination also from overhead skylights. Airflow ventilation was not appropriate between raw and roasted areas. And it's very important in your raw areas that your air pressure is under pressured or negative. And in the roasted areas, which would be considered clean areas, you would want to have positive or over pressured areas. And this was not the case. They also had a number of unsanitary conditions, some of which were product residues were found, equipment washrooms, pest control sightings, and things along that line. Now, as FDA began to investigate, they found that the PCA company did have another plant in Texas. This plant was not registered with the FDA. And they went into the plant and they also found serious deficiencies and food safety issues at that location. So 4 years after that salmonella outbreak, and this was in 2013, authorities charged the former owners of the company and several employees with fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. And the owners are now in jail. The quality manager did also go to jail along with this for the role that they took. And if you remember FSMA, the requirement is for the owner, operator, or agent in charge to sign off on the food safety plan. And, you know, this is something, when I do my training, we talk about that person as the go to jail person. So that's certainly the case in this situation. So next, what I wanted to do with you today is talk about some other recalls that have affected the food industry. This is the first one, and this is a manufacturer of pita chips. And the issue that they had was undeclared milk ingredients. And as you know, this could have an allergic effect on the people that could be sensitive to milk if it's not on the label and they don't read that. Allergens related recalls make up 1/3 of all reports in the reportable food registry. I included this one because this one was a supplier of dry whey powder. And again, it had the potential to be contaminated with salmonella. And they were a supplier to the industry, many food companies. Sometimes you have a supplier recall supplying multiple plants, and then there is a domino effect. Many other corporations are affected through the investigations. And this is one such company. They did get that whey powder, and they had to recall due to the potential presence of salmonella. And I think you might have seen some other recalls out there where the lot codes, the timing is set, maybe March 1 through May 1, and then they expand it. And this also expands the number of companies that could be affected when those companies expand their dates of their investigation and their recall. Now here is another one. This is a macadamia nut supplier. And in this case, they found a potential contamination of E. coli in the well water, and also a distribution system that supplies the firm's operations. So it was quite widespread. We have a recall for coconut smiles because of salmonella, potential for salmonella. And this was linked to dried coconut. And the FDA testing, and they used whole gene sequencing, confirmed that salmonella matching the outbreak strain was found in the retail packaging distributed by the suppliers. And this one was first initiated by the distributor. Here is another nut company, roasted and salted in-shell pistachios, another salmonella potential contamination. And this was their supplier. The company's processor and supplier voluntarily initiated the recall after a separate and unaffiliated manufacturer performed a routine test which revealed salmonella. So sometimes when the FDA gets into the situation and they start investigating, they're looking for who that company sent the goods to, the supply to. And that's where often you see multiple expansions of recalls as part of an outbreak. So here we have another one. This is a wheat let's see, may contain milk, soy, wheat, and cashews, not declared on the package. Now with this one, it's a little bit different because it's due to an error by the packaging supplier who alerted them. After they investigated, the packaging supplier did not put the allergen declaration information onto that package, which resulted in this recall. Dill pickle flavored potato chips, another one, undeclared milk, not on the label. Now this one was quite a large outbreak of salmonella infections with a Honey Smacks cereal. And this occurred several years ago, but FDA did use whole gene sequencing to track down the source of this. And they learned about a cluster of the salmonella in multiple states. And their investigation occurred from May 2018 to September 2018. And there were multiple notices, at least 2, just to alert consumers that this product could still be on the shelves. And what was found is that the salmonella was identified at a co-manufacturer of the company. So not the actual plant of the company, but their co-manufacturer was the source. So it's very important to make sure your suppliers and co-mans have strong sanitation and environmental monitoring programs, if appropriate, as is indicated in the hazard analysis. Now this recall product was distributed across the US, Guam, and also internationally. 135 illnesses, 35 hospitalizations, no deaths, but there was a warning letter issued. And that's what I want to talk to you about next. So this was a warning letter from the inspection. Some things that weren't addressed appropriately, so that initiated the warning letter from the FDA. And you can learn so much from these warning letters. I hope that you can also sign up for the FDA, on the FDA website to get warning letter information. Very important. You can read about gaps to compliance to FSMA and see what types of things the FDA is calling out when they come in to do their investigations and their evaluations for compliance. And I just wanted to go through a few of the things that they identified. And one was that the cereal was adulterated based on Section 402 of the FD&C Act. And this was through environmental samples that were taken. The hazard analysis, which we'll be talking more about today, did not identify a known or reasonably foreseeable hazard for the food manufactured, processed, packed, or held. They had no evaluation of environmental pathogens, and this was a ready-to-eat food exposed to the environment prior to packaging. So that was an important program that they put in place that they didn't have, that they should have put in place. No preventive control for sanitation for contamination of the environment from pathogens. No written corrective action procedures to address actions to take if preventive controls were not properly implemented. And so this was a big part of the failure. They did not include root cause or corrective actions so that it would not happen again. And then sanitation verification activities were not implemented to assure effective controls to significantly minimize or prevent the hazard were in place. Now here is another one. This is a more recent one that many of you have probably heard about in the news. And again, this is a multi-state outbreak of Salmonella Newport infections linked to Thompson International onions. And I brought this one up again because it does talk about supply chain impact. And what you can see is FDA's traceback investigation. It's still ongoing, but they have identified that onions were distributed to wholesalers, restaurants, and retail stores in all 50 states, the District of Columbia, and Canada between May 1 and August 1 of this year. And the recall actually included all varieties of the onions. And this included red, yellow, white, and sweet onions sold under the names listed there on the slide. And what the concern was that they felt that they could potentially be contaminated. The red onions could have cross-contaminated the other onions. And so that was what happened with this, with the recall notification. Now, as FDA investigates, again, as I mentioned before, the supply chain was affected. One of the suppliers who sourced from the company, they also supplied other companies, and you can see here 4 large food stores recalling cheese dips because of possible health risk. And these are only a few of the companies that were involved in this outbreak. So as we look at this information here, because it's ongoing, the numbers have changed. So as of August 18th, a total of 869 people from 47 states have now been infected. A total of 116 hospitalizations and no deaths. And in Canada, they also reported 339 illnesses over 7 provinces. And as I was continuing to investigate this one, as part of their root cause investigation, the company is collecting and analyzing not only onions, but water and environmental samples. So before I go to the next slide, I just wanted to bring up another one that occurred this past week, bagged peaches from a packing company on the West Coast, Waona Packing Company. And this was another instance where salmonella infections linked to consumption of these peaches has been identified. And so far there have been 68 reported cases of salmonella, resulting in 14 hospitalizations in 9 states. And the target company was one of the more recent recipients of these and has initiated a recall. So as far as lessons learned, I think we can see the importance of validation activities and verification activities to help prevent food safety hazards and outbreaks and recalls. And some of these very important verification activities include setting up a robust supplier standard program, developing food safety and quality expectations, defining those for your suppliers. I know when I was with Kellogg's, that was part of our contracts, that we had this information in there, and they would sign off on these documents to agree that they would meet our expectations to supply us. Setting up an audit program of ingredient suppliers, sensitive ingredients, using second or third party audits, things like GFSI. At Kellogg's, we had our internal audit program where we would go out to the sensitive ingredients, establishing COA and testing requirements, making sure you have a program for verifying labels and food safety plans, documentation reviews, and very important sanitation and allergen verifications which Dave and I will be talking a lot about as we move through this week. And then the last point there is sanitation breaks. Very, very important to have some type of cleaning break to be able to define your traceability and lot batch definition. And that was something that was an issue when we had that recall for the peanut butter crackers. Thank you very much. Now, Amy, my next slide is, oh, there it is. Thank you. So now we will discuss the Food Safety Modernization Act and regulatory expectations. This is only meant as an overview of the FSMA regulations. And we can talk about where you can get more information after this session is over. So as part of the overview, I will be focusing on the FDA preventive control for human food regulation. And this is going to be focused mostly on allergens and sanitation preventive controls, but I will be talking about the others as well, just to make sure, understand the supply chain impact as well. Talking about key FDA implementation considerations, industry feedback on inspections, and talking about some of the FDA numbers from 2018. And also want to just make sure a reminder that you might have to meet other regulatory requirements for your region or for the type of food that you manufacture. So why is FSMA needed? I think we all know why, and I talked about some of the drivers of FSMA. There were many others outbreaks that occurred that also led to it, but I believe that the realization was that our food supply chain is global now, and the FDA regulates over 49 billion worth of imported food. And this is approximately 19% of the food supply. This includes 90% of seafood, 52% of fresh vegetables, and 52% of fresh, or 52% of fresh fruits and 22% of fresh vegetables. The food supply is much more complex. More foods in the marketplace. If you think about when you go into one of your big supermarkets, food supermarkets, Whole Foods, Trader Joe's, other large regional food companies, there are foods again from around the world. And we also have new hazards in food that were not previously seen. Things like emerging pathogens, pathogenic organisms. We have shifting demographics, a growing population, and some of those individuals are especially at risk for foodborne illnesses. Their immune systems may be compromised as well. So the goal of FSMA is to move to a more preventive mode, a preventive approach, move away from reacting when food safety issues happen, shifting their paradigm towards prevention to protect consumers. Prevention is the key. FDA has been very good about communicating their program requirements, and they're committed to educating while they regulate. And that is their message as they move through FSMA compliance activities. The goal is also to create a self-sustaining system, encouraging the prevention of food safety problems throughout the supply chain, really before this affects the consumer. Prevention is the key, as I mentioned in the last slide. but very, very close interrelationship along with prevention is the enhanced partnerships, import safety, FSVP program, and the inspections, compliance, and response that takes place. So as far as this regulation was historic, there's no doubt about that. It was signed into law in 2011, and it was the first change to the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act since 1938. That's a long time. And it created a new food safety system, again, focusing on prevention and accountability, new system of import oversight, emphasizing those partnerships and farm to table responsibility. And it was developed through a broad coalition. Many of you probably are affected by these 7 final rules. Depending on the size of your firm, all are now in effect. And some of you, if you were small or very small, you may have fallen into the regulation requirements at different dates. So you can see the human food, preventive control for human food and animal food, produce safety regulation, foreign supplier verification, the third-party auditor accreditation, sanitary transport, and food defense intentional adulteration. So these affect all of us, consumers, retailers, manufacturing, farmers, auditors, transportation, all throughout the supply chain. Now, in the past, our main focus was on hazard analysis and CCPs from the process. So what you can see here with FSMA, now the food safety plan also includes hazards that could be presented from sanitation, allergens, and sanitation programs, sanitation, allergens, and supply chain. When we're talking about the regulation, we can't forget about the good manufacturing practices, the current good manufacturing practices. And this is 21 CFR 117, subpart B. This replaces 21 CFR 110. And I have to say, when I go into a food plant, how many of these basic components are not always in place. Just the basic foundational programs that are critical to hold up the program. Many of these are prerequisite programs, but personnel hygiene, plant and grounds, sanitary operations, the equipment and utensils and processes and controls, storage, warehousing, and distribution. And some of these components, you may determine that they're preventive controls based on the hazard analysis that you do for your facility. So the food safety plan, it starts with the hazard analysis. It's very critical, and it must be done for each manufacturing location. Preventive controls, you could decide through your hazard analysis that you have a process, an allergen, a sanitation, or a supply chain preventive control. Or you may determine that you have another one that is something you want to control as part of the food that you're manufacturing. If you determine that you have a preventive control, you must establish management components, monitoring programs and procedures, corrective action, verification. Verification is required when a hazard requiring a preventive control is identified. So you will have to do that. A number of you may have taken the Preventive Control for Human Food course, and some of this is probably a review for you. But again, I just wanted to stress prevention. It is the cornerstone, and the important, again, first step is that hazard analysis to identify risks and hazards in your process, implementation controls, monitoring corrective actions, and very, very important is the documentation throughout your program requirements. I'm going to be going through several definitions in the next few slides just to reinforce some of the points that we're making here. Under the regulation, certain tasks must be performed or overseen by a preventive controls qualified individual. This is a qualified individual who has successfully completed training in the development and application of risk-based preventive controls, at least equivalent to that received under a standardized curriculum recognized as adequate by FDA, or is otherwise qualified through job experience to develop and apply a food safety system. This preventive controls qualified individual, they have responsibilities. And remember, they either perform or oversee these different tasks and responsibilities. One is preparation of the food safety plan, validation of the preventive controls, record review, reanalysis of the food safety plan. I was conducting one training, and one of the quality managers in the course, they were very concerned because they have records that pile every day and need to be reviewed. And he was concerned he would have to review every one. But it was clearly defined to him that he could oversee the activity if he has a person that is trained to do that part of the responsibility. But he ultimately was responsible, perform or oversee that step. So I thought it would be good to give you the definition for food safety plan. Pretty straightforward, a set of written documents based on food safety principles, and this incorporating that hazard analysis, preventive controls, supply chain programs, and a recall. Because if you remember, if you've identified preventive control, you do have to have a recall plan, even though you might want to have, most plants will have one anyway as well. But you definitely will have to include monitoring, corrective action, and verification activities, which I've mentioned several times. The food safety system is the outcome of implementing the food safety plan and its supporting elements. The definition of hazard is any biological, chemical, and this is now including radiological because that has been added to the regulation, or physical agent that has the potential to cause illness or injury. And this is a new one in the regulation as far as definition, known or reasonably foreseeable hazard. And this is again, biological, chemical, including radiological or physical hazard that is known to be. So there's information that is out there. There's evidence that this hazard is known to be or has the potential to be associated with the facility or the food. And if you remember in that warning letter that I reviewed with you, the co-manufacturer of the cereal did not evaluate known or reasonably foreseeable hazards. And that is absolutely something that FDA will call out if they come into your plant and you have not identified. So taking that information, now we have a hazard that's requiring a food requiring a preventive control in your food safety plan. And this is a known or reasonably foreseeable hazard, and that's based on the outcome of the hazard analysis. And this is where you would establish one or more preventive controls to significantly minimize or prevent the hazard in a food, and the components to manage those controls that I've already mentioned several times, and that includes monitoring corrections or corrective actions, verification, and records. And again, this is as appropriate to the food and the facility. So those are all part of the hazard analysis and risk assessment. So this is the last one, but now we have preventive controls. These are those risk-based, reasonably appropriate procedures, practices, and processes that a person knowledgeable about the safe manufacturing, process, packing, or holding of food would employ to significantly minimize or prevent the hazards identified under the hazard analysis. So very important there as well. So I think hopefully you realize that the hazard analysis is everything. It's the starting point, and it's crucial to the success of the overall food safety program and its effectiveness. If you do it right, your hazard analysis can identify hazards requiring a preventive control and focus resources. Some food facilities are not large, and they need to make sure that they correctly identify what preventive controls you're going to manage, and also identifying operations that you might require improvement. An improper hazard analysis is pretty, straightforward. It could lead to an ineffective food safety plan and an unmanageable food safety plan. And what does that mean? That means you may have identified everything as a PC, but then guess what? You have to manage it. And if you have, the FDA can request those documents if you've identified something as a preventive control. And again, for each of those, you have to document monitoring, corrective action, and verification. I remember long ago when I was with a company, a bakery, and we had determined there were 30 to 40, what we called then, of course, CCPs, and it was not manageable, and it certainly wouldn't be in this food safety plan, in this FSMA environment. And also potential for regulatory action. You can see from those warning letters, others that you might see as you get the notices, there could be action taken if you haven't done these things. So you can't forget other considerations as you're reviewing hazards for the food type that you're manufacturing. You have to think about the formulation of the food. It's very common for food companies that you have product developers, they like to be very creative, adding new ingredients, maybe something from a foreign country that is not as well known, some seed or some ingredient. You have to think about the design of the facility and equipment, and Dave and I will be talking about that as we move through this week. Raw materials and ingredients, transportation practices, and do not forget rework. Rework has caused many recalls due to improper storage, labeling, and cross-contamination or cross-contact. Packaging and label activities, and then for sure storage and distribution. Definitely need to know who are the intended or reasonably foreseeable people that will use this food. Sanitation, including employee hygiene, is very important as well. And there are other factors that you need to consider as part of your hazard analysis, and likely through your food safety team, because having that diverse group of people hopefully on the team can give different insight as well. So we talked about the hazard analysis and the need to determine that you will need to have a preventive control. Some of the potential PCs that you might identify: biological hazards, process controls that could kill those pathogens, things like pasteurizing and roasting. And then you could have other process controls that could prevent growth, maybe pH, time, temperature controls, formulation checks. And then definitely you may have, as part of your biological controls, supply chain programs for sensitive ingredients used without a kill step, and sanitation controls that prevent recontamination. Chemical hazards that you might identify may involve that you put in place a supply chain program, a supply chain preventive control, allergen labeling, and sanitation controls to prevent not only allergen cross-contact, but also cross-contamination if you're talking about a biological hazard. Physical hazards are probably the ones that are most straightforward as far as filtering, metal detection, and X-ray devices. So this slide is from the Reportable Food Registry. And it, as I said, is that electronic portal where the food, where you can report foods when it's reasonably likely to cause illness, injury, or death. And as you can see, biological hazards in the food are the ones that are reported most frequently. Undeclared allergens, as I said before, represent about 1/3 of the reports. And I know this was a little bit dated, but these numbers are pretty consistent through the years. These are still the types of things that are reported in the RFR. So these are the big 8, which you are familiar with, I'm sure. And you know, the big 8 has been out there. They are required as part of labeling regulations. Just something to point out: tree nuts, it really is species specific. You know, you need to make sure you consider coconut and tree nuts, all the different types of tree nuts, and also for fish and crustacean. Now, these are the ones that are required in the US. The FDA is evaluating sesame seed, so that is under evaluation. Other countries also have allergens of concern that you might be aware of. Sesame seed, celery, lupin, and mustard are some of those concerns that other countries may have. So for allergen prevention controls, it is important to prevent allergen cross-contact. And you remember, if you did take the preventive controls for human food course, preventing allergen cross-contact and preventing sanitation cross-contamination. So for allergens, it's important to clean shared equipment, and that's where you would likely have a potential sanitation control. And you would have a procedure or an SSOP, sanitation standard operating procedure, to identify all the steps you would take. And, you know, in a perfect world, food plants would have dedicated equipment so they wouldn't have to worry about these things, but that is not very often the case. Properly managing that rework, and this would be for allergen cross contact from storage, labeling, container use, utensil use, things along that line. They could all impact and cause allergen cross contact. And avoiding in-process or post-process allergen cross contact as well. So accurate labeling of finished food is very important, making sure those labels are correct. Potential supply chain programs, I mentioned that one recall for the packaging supplier. So you need to make sure that the right labels are in place. And all of these things, the really main component is also training. You need to make sure people know to not put those roll stocks in place until the next run. Maybe you have something like a barcode reader to make sure you have the appropriate packaging in place for that run. So from the RFR, the biological agents cause more outbreaks. And these numbers, while they've gone up, they've stayed fairly consistent in these different categories. So you can see the numbers of outbreaks, illnesses, hospitalizations, and deaths. And the chemical hazard type is really related primarily to the allergens. So in this slide, sources of biological hazards can come from ingredients, environment, or people. And we talked about some of the consequences of recalls in the past module from the supply chain of the ingredients. And also considerations for process controls, as I mentioned in a previous slide, cooking, chilling, those types of things, roasting, very important. The environment is also key to control. Not only sanitation controls, but cleaning, sanitizing, sanitary design of your equipment, and zoning. And then again, process controls. People, and again, this is very important. Hazards could include from the process controls, sanitation controls, and zoning. Maybe they're not following the proper zoning requirements as they move through the plant. GMPs, training, personal hygiene, and disease exclusion. Very important. So it's always best to put measures in place to prevent that contamination before it enters a food plant. So prevention, you can see, is the largest cog in that wheel. And prevention programs are important, but you also have to kill them, especially if you can't see them, which of course many organisms you can't. So programs for killing them and controlling growth before the logarithmic growth takes off in a plant. So if you have sanitation preventive controls as identified in your hazard analysis, you will need to have procedures in place for explaining how you're going to clean food contact surfaces. And again, these are usually through sanitation standard operating procedures. Prevention of allergen cross-contact and cross-contamination, and this can come from many sources, as you know, from insanitary objects, from people to food packaging material, and other contact surfaces. You have to make sure that the packaging is stored appropriately in warehouse areas and that it's labeled appropriately. Sometimes roll stock is not completely used for a run and it goes back into the warehouse. It needs to be properly labeled and placed so people don't make the mistake of using that on a line. And then also preventing from raw product to processed product. And again, that's when the hazard analysis identifies that there could be a hazard. As part of sanitation verification, you may have an environmental monitoring program. And as part of the regulation, you need one in facilities where ready-to-eat product is exposed to the environment before packaging. And guess what? You need to design your program, needs to be customized to each facility, but design it so that you can find that organism. I know you don't really want to find it, but you really need to focus on finding it so it doesn't become a big issue and it doesn't grow in the plant and find niche points, so it's very hard to eliminate. So later, David and I will talk more about hygienic zoning consideration and equipment design and things along that sort as we move through our modules. But in this slide, I just wanted to reinforce the importance of building design and infrastructure. Personnel, materials, and other traffic flow, transition areas, room air, HVAC systems, very, very important. We had a recall one time because the overhead air vent was not cleaned appropriately between allergenic products. One had the allergen, one didn't. The air, the debris from the vent filtered down onto the line, and it led to a recall because of that cross contact. Compressed air is also something not to overlook, especially if used in direct product contact. And then support areas. FDA will evaluate your environmental program and the findings. So as I mentioned, transition areas, you need to make sure you have clear plans in place. And definitely it's very helpful to put a map together to show a plant and where these different areas are for non-manufacturing, your basic GMP areas. Primary pathogen control areas are also controlled and restricted access to some of the hygiene areas. One thing that I found when I go in a plant, I don't tell them where to take me, but I tell them to take me on their normal tour. And it's always a red flag. Couple things. If they start from the raw area of the plant moving through to the finished product part, which sounds reasonable because you're starting at the beginning, but there is potential for contamination, cross-contamination, cross-contact as you're moving through those areas. And then sometimes they move you through sanitation rooms that are wet, and then you move back into the other areas, so the transition areas could be affected as well. So you have to think about all of those things in your plan and how best to zone your plant, especially if you have some risk in these areas. So in the next few slides, what I want to talk about is FDA FSMA implementation considerations. These are some of the things that the FDA has talked about in some of the meetings that have taken place over the last few years about what the focus is and where the resource focus is and what they will be looking for. And then the next slides will talk about some industry perspective and what they've seen in some of the inspections that have taken place. So as far as focus, FDA focus, there's still that focus on GMPs and definitely preventive controls, but the modernized GMPs, FDA is still looking for potential compliance issues, filth, adulteration that could affect the food stream and the food. Preventive controls, these are the ones we're talking about that are identified in your food safety plan as part of your hazard analysis. So you may have a sanitation control program, and this is where you're going to be looking at potential for cross-contamination in a facility. There's focus from FDA on equipment cleaning and sanitation, and also, again, those SSOPs, environmental monitoring programs as appropriate, allergen control programs, and again, the potential for cleaning and sanitizing equipment. So this could be another SSOP for sanitation for removing allergens. And then again, potential cross-contact and labeling controls. All things to consider as part of your food safety plan and your hazard analysis. FDA inspections have also focused on preventive controls for the process, your cook steps, your kill steps, thermal processing, product formulation, pH for some products is very important to keep growth regulated, pathogenic growth, refrigeration, and supply chain controls. Now, if you remember, if you've taken the preventive control for human food course, process preventive controls, you do need to have validation studies. And this is to prove that you can kill the organism. It's scientific data that really talks about how you're going to control a measure and that it's capable of effectively controlling the hazard every time. And validation is doing the right thing. Verification activities, which we'll talk about, are doing what we say we will do. And that's the application of all the procedures and tests and the evaluation and monitoring. So now some information that I think is good to share with you about industry feedback, FDA focus, some of the 483 information, and then also industry discussions at some of the food safety meetings that have occurred over the past several years. So some of the feedback talked about regulatory focus on allergens. You know, again, that's very important. Consumers can be affected, have issues, can die if they consume an allergen that's not on that label. Standard operating procedures, changeovers are extremely important, including those sanitation standard operating procedures to define what cleaning activities will take to make sure changeovers are effective. Sanitation, important to have environmental monitoring for ready-to-eat foods, especially in hygiene areas. Process controls, and these are really critical for a reason. Some plants will use CCPs when they're talking about their process controls. Kill steps reviewed as part of the preventive controls. The FDA will do that. Discussions about formula management and foreign material controls. Some other areas of FDA inspections include review of qualified individual information. And this is to see documentation that employees are qualified to perform their assigned tasks. And it includes also supervisors and managers. Review of withdrawal and recall plans, and a focus on your food safety plan, looking for specific language about preventive controls in the flow chart. Receiving practices and inspection, training programs are very important in documentation, and ingredient sourcing and your supplier approval and verification programs. Very important to have those procedures in place as part of an SOP to describe what you're going to do. So very important, and as you can imagine, for any audit, including regulatory inspections, a big focus on document review. And document review, looking for written procedures for each of those management components that we spoke of, documentation of that implementation of the components, reviewing the documents, looking to see how you are managing and implementing your programs regarding those preventive controls. So see your records in that area, and justifying that your approach is important, and to document. And again, as part of your food safety plan, you may decide something is not a preventive control, but if you remember, it's important to justify why it is and why it's not as part of that hazard analysis. Now, these are some of the results. It's a little bit dated, but it does show some of the activity through FDA, some of the accomplished inspections. You can see for the different categories that they've listed here, very active. And these are some of those 483 observations. And you can see some of the categories that stand out a little bit, and these numbers have gone up for sure, but some of the categories remain fairly consistent. Bakery products with some of the issues that could occur, you know, definitely allergens in the bakery world, that can be something that they have to put particular focus on, things along that line. And then there's some foreign supplier verification, foreign supplier audits that they do in other countries as well. So other regulatory requirements that might affect you, that you might have to meet, you may have local regulations in your area that are required for your state, for your local area. Food defense and biosecurity, labeling requirements, nutritional requirements, procedures to guard against economic fraud. You may also, the food type that you manufacture, you may also be under the seafood and juiced HACCP requirements or the international HACCP regulations. USDA could be something that you fall under. Some plants will have both FDA and USDA that they have to work with. You might have preventive controls for animal food regulations, produce safety, and sanitary food transport as well. And also the FSVP requirements, especially if you have ingredients from other countries, you would fall under those requirements as well. So I want to thank you, and next, I think we have a few minutes here to talk about some questions that you might have for the presentation. Pretty straightforward as we move into the rest of the week. David will be talking more about equipment sanitation, and we'll talk about some other key issues with sanitation failures and things that can happen, and then verification and validation. So are there questions?
Hi, thanks so much, Jennifer. We do have a couple questions, and just a reminder for everyone out there, if you have one yourself, you're welcome to type them into the questions box, and we'll do our best to get as many in as we can. Our first question is, where can I learn more about FSMA?
Okay, well, this was definitely just an overview, and there's a lot of information out there. You know, I would just highly recommend going to the fda.gov website and look under FSMA, and you can find a wealth of information. And I wanted to also point out that there are guidance documents that can help you not only give you program information, but also if you go into the guidance documents, the hazard analysis and risk-based preventive controls for human food guidance for industry is very, very valuable. And if it's a very long document, so you have to kind of watch out not to tie up your printer um, and have enough ink as well. But that's very valuable, as well as Appendix 1 of this document. Appendix 1, many of you may know, it's been an evaluation of different food types. It's not complete, but it gives you a good idea of what type of risks you might have in the biological chemical areas, and also potential process hazards that you might have for your food type. So definitely recommend those. There is also a FSMA TAN, Technical Assistance Network. And if you have any questions related to regulatory areas, you would need to go to the FDA TAN. If you have technical questions, you can go to the FSPCA website and be directed to a technical person to answer your question. You submit it and they will respond to you with their answers. But one thing you might also want to do, because they have had many questions over the past few years, they do have a frequently asked questions document that is on the website again, and all these things are free for you to download. And that can be very valuable too. And then your question is answered. So you could do that. And then the thing that I found most valuable is the FSPCA courses. And this is the Food Safety Preventive Controls Alliance. And you could take the various courses. Some of them are over several days. Preventive control for human, animal, FSVP, produce safety, intentional adulteration. So those are a few of them that you can definitely take to get more information, and it can be very valuable to get some of the nuances and also some more resources that you can use to really focus in on the products that you make, so that you could identify the hazards that are as part of your food type. So those are some of the things that I found very useful to give you more information that you might need.
That's great. And also I'll mention, for those of you who haven't been on the EAS website, we have a lot of resources, a lot of complimentary webinars on FSMA basics, white papers, articles, short videos, so lots of different things that you might find helpful as well. The next question is regarding sanitation preventive controls. Specifically, can they be the normal SSOP activities, verification, et cetera, or do they need to be elevated beyond standard SSOPs?
Well, sanitation has got so many different variables in it. I'm not sure that using sanitation specifically as a preventive control, and I guess what I mean by that is the fact that I've done cleaning doesn't mean I've got a preventive control, unless you can show that it has been effective. So I'm kind of cautious about using sanitation as a preventive control for that particular reason. I think you have to validate that it does what you want to do. And when I say validate, in my opinion, that's worst case situation. If you're running normally for 8 hours, but have some runs that are 16 to 24 hours, you validate on the 16 to 24 hour cycle. And then if you run 8 hours or 12 hours, you should be good, because your soil hasn't built up as much. And then you verify that you've done it by taking swabs, by watching your procedure, whatever you've done. So it's kind of hard to have a preventive control just on sanitation. There's a lot involved there.
And many of the sanitation activities, program activities, can be managed as prerequisite controls. And so, mainly with the rule, we're talking about, sanitation for potential allergen cross-contact and pathogen cross-contamination. So those are the drivers for potential food safety issues and hazards.
Okay, great. Can you give an example of a formulation check?
Formulation check could be something like a pH to make sure the acid is where you want, to make sure it controls the organism that you've identified. So formulation pH. Some other things could be, oh gosh, adding a certain chemical, not chemical, but Dave, do you have another example that might be useful?
Well, you know, I'm thinking that if you've got a product that has certain water activity, you need to have 10 pounds of this and 20 pounds of that, and you make sure that all your ingredients are in there, and knowing that you've got the right ingredients in the right amount in there, that would be something for a formulation check, because that would get your water activity to the level that you're looking for.
Right.
Our next question is food defense and food security part of the preventive controls for FSMA?
It has its own regulation, and some firms are not under this regulation until, let's see, I have the rules here, until next year. Very small businesses next year, but small businesses kick in this year, July 27th, and large businesses fall under intentional adulteration. That was in 2019. So as far as PCs, these are not preventive controls, but they have their own regulation requirement.
Next question is regarding what is a good way to determine a lot break?
You know, that depends on the product that you're running. Some products run for a whole day and then they stop. Some of it is a business decision, but most of it relies on microcontamination and the need to clean that food so it doesn't build up and cause issues of contamination. So, you know, definitely having a sanitation break that you can clearly identify for your food type is important, because that is basically your window for a potential recall that you might have or issue. Dave, did you have a comment on that?
Well, I think the important thing there is to make sure that your sanitation for that break is effective. What's the weakest point? And one of the tough ones that I remember seeing over the years was a plant that had brine just before packaging. And all the products went through this brine before they went into packaging. And you know, how is the brine cleaned out? Well, the brine itself was at a level that there was not going to be any bacteria growing, and it would be cidal to most bacteria, you know, any pathogens. But what about the area where there was a buildup along the edges of the brine plume there? And so they had to go through and clean those brine tanks by scrubbing them, which was not an easy thing to do. And all the brine had to be pumped out, and it was a major effort that they had to do. And so you want to take a look at your process and see what might be a weak point in you know, your lot identification. Do you have any places where things build up that you're not considering for your lot breaks there?
We have I believe, a follow-on question, which is, what if we use the same lot but have sanitation after 10 days of production?
If you use the same lot and then after 10 days, that would be your break after 10 days. Is that correct? Before
yes.
sanitation. Well, again, some of it is a decision that you make, because you know, definitely as a business, you're going to have to consider that whole lot. And if it goes for 10 days, that may be your window. If you find that you have contamination after that point through your test results or through, you know, through issues that you might find information investigations or sicknesses that you know, evident through FDA or CDC. You know, so definitely, you know, if a business decides 10 days and then they break, that 10 days could be affected in the recall.
I think it kind of depends upon the product that you're manufacturing. For example, in a powder operation, you have to run several days to you know, in a row, because the process of cleaning is such a long, laborious process. On the other hand, if you've got a wet cleaning operation, you're probably going to get some raised eyebrows from FDA or whoever your regulatory authority is about having such a long time frame there. I was involved with one situation where they literally wanted to do a 24-hour lot, and FDA was saying, no, we don't think that's a good idea for you. And so that went back and forth. So it's going to depend upon what your data is, what your exposure is. You know, is it a perishable product? Is it a shelf-stable product? And what it takes to do a good clean break. If you've got a 3-day cleanup, you know, that's going to be something that the regulators are going to look at and say, well, you can't do an everyday cleanup just because it takes 3 days for you to clean up. So it's going to be a fairly complicated answer on a situation, and I don't know what the circumstances are for the long time, but those are some things that I would consider.
And definitely building some history of that product. Usually in the beginning, when you're first starting manufacturing, you could do it for different times and test and see what the results are to make sure the sanitation is most effective during, you know, the time frame that you've built that data. And that's important as well.
Okay, thank you both. I don't see any other questions coming in. So we will see you all out. Oh, hold on. We just got one more that was emailed in. Hold on one second. Follow-on question for the sanitation check. Is it pathogens only?
For sanitation check. You know, Dave, you might be better to answer this. Certainly FSMA is, you know, focused on pathogens that could cause adverse illnesses and effects. Dave, do you have a comment on that?
Well, I would say probably not. I would say it's going to be product specific. And let's take fluid milk, for example. The chances of a pathogen in that are certainly possible, but because it's sealed, it's pasteurized, and goes to a filler and then is sealed, very few pathogens have occurred in fluid milk. Your bigger concern is spoilage, and so that would be something that you would look at. While you would certainly look at pathogens, and if you're not looking at pathogens, you'd be remiss in your duties. Your first look would be just at spoilage bacteria, and others are going to have a higher risk of pathogens than spoilage. Powdered products, for example, salmonella is always going to be an issue there, and so it's going to depend upon what your product is. But I would look at spoilage, and I would take a look at you know, where your exposure is based on what your product is.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. So we are officially out of time for questions, and we will see everyone tomorrow at 1 o'clock Eastern, same link. And we thank you all for joining us today. Have a good day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.